Gothic 1 and 2 are some of my favorite games of all time, being some of the most deeply satisfying and immersive action-adventure RPGs that I've ever played. While most people in the early 2000s were raving about how great Morrowind was, I was busy playing Gothic, and my experience with those games fundamentally altered my ability to appreciate other, similar types of games because the early Gothic games were truly ahead of their time and did some really impressive things that other developers weren't doing at the time and still aren't doing to this day. I sometimes struggle, however, to decide which of the two Gothic games I like better, with Gothic 2 being a direct sequel to the first game, directly continuing the story with many of the exact same characters in the exact same world, and being built on the exact same game engine. They're about as similar as two games in a series can be, and so I often like to think of them as essentially one game broken into two parts. At the end of the day, however, they are separate games with some key differences, so I thought I'd take some time to review the two games against one another and discuss the relative pros and cons of each game. Common wisdom argues that Gothic 2 is the definitively better game, since it had the opportunity to build and improve upon the successful foundation set by the first game, which was not only the first game in the series, but also Piranha Bytes' very first game. Whereas Piranha Bytes had to build the entire concept of the Gothic series from scratch with the first game, they had all of the important pieces already in place for the sequel, and could therefore focus on improving the overall quality of the gameplay while also expanding the breadth and depth of its content. After playing the two games back to back, it's clear that Gothic 1 is a little unrefined and a little lacking in overall content compared to its sequel, but it does actually do a few things better than Gothic 2. Whereas Gothic 2 takes place in a relatively generic, albeit incredibly well-realized medieval fantasy setting, which is ultimately more similar to other fantasy RPGs than it is dissimilar, Gothic 1 is set inside a magically encapsulated prison colony run in total anarchy by the convicts. That's really all I should have to say, since so few games have ever been set inside a prison, and as far as I'm aware, none other than Gothic have been fantasy RPGs. While it doesn't really resemble a modern prison, it definitely gives off that prison-esque feeling in terms of the way other convicts treat you. This is truly a dog-eat-dog world where the strongest make the rules and everyone else falls in line. The game really drives this aspect home, with the opening cutscene showing you getting punched in the face as you're welcomed to the colony, and then as other convicts try to beat you up, lure you into traps, force you into doing repetitive mundane chores, and extort money from you. It really emphasizes the fact that, as the new guy, you're the low man on the totem pole and everyone else is going to take advantage of you as much as possible. Then you've got the way the convicts have split into three factions, each with their own lifestyle and ideologies, from the old camp where the ore barons are content to live as kings inside the barrier by mining magic ore and negotiating the ore trade for outside goods, to the new camp where they farm rice and brew schnapps while the water mages work to find a way to blow up the barrier, and to the swamp camp where they harvest and smoke swamp weed while praying to a god known as the Sleeper, whom they believe will set them free. And the whole world is relatively dark and dangerous, filled with exotic, dangerous beasts, ancient crumbling ruins, savage orc lands, and a weird sense of the occult. Gothic 2, in contrast, consists of a more conventional harbor city and neighboring farmlands, which isn't all that unique, and the faction system with the town militia, the farmers' mercenaries, and the magicians of fire don't play as interesting of a role in establishing the world's lore and backstory like the factions from Gothic 1. Gothic 2's story is more of a broad concept, defeat the dragons, with a bunch of preliminary roadblocks and unrelated sub-goals for other people before you can actually fight the dragons, like find a way into town, get into the upper quarter, retrieve Garand's situation report for Lord Hagen, get the ore reports for Garand, retrieve the Eye of Enos, and recharge the Eye of Enos, all before you can even start to fight the dragons. It does have a few twists and turns in the story, notably when the Seekers are sent to hunt you down, and when the Eye of Enos is stolen and subsequently destroyed, plus the ending cutscene where we get to see Xardus' true motives, but it doesn't really feel like a story. Rather, it's more like a series of video game objectives assembled together in a linear fashion vaguely resembling a story. It's enough to keep you engaged and to keep the gameplay moving forward, but the story is more about setting up gameplay scenarios than telling an actual story. The story in Gothic 1 plays out more like an actual story, with the nameless hero arriving in the colony simply trying to find a way to survive before getting wrapped up in a plot to stop the orcs from summoning a god that will destroy all human life inside the barrier. Except for one moment when you're sent to retrieve 5 focus stones, it never really feels like cliché video game objectives in place of plot, since the story flows logically and organically from gaining admission to a camp, to being sent on your first mission, to investigating the curious goings-on at the swamp camp, to helping them prepare for a ritual to commune with their god, to seeking out the orcish graveyard seen in the ritual's vision, and to realizing that the swamp camp sleeper is really an orcish god and that you have to stop him from awakening. There's a lot more exposition and build up to the main plot in Gothic 1, and it has a way stronger progression as you go through the various stages of the story and uncover new information. Gothic 2 has a ton of quests, and they're all pretty good mechanically, but the subject matter of those quests isn't always the most interesting. A lot of them are usually pretty mundane, like harvest turnips for Lobart, get Mateo's money from Gritta, chase down the thief Rangaroo, kill the bandits in Jack's lighthouse, and so on. Or devolve into tedious busy work like purify all the shrines and kill all the orc warlords. Even more important quests that seem like they should be interesting come off feeling a little simple. Recharging the Eye of Innos, for example, just amounts to fetching a book from Sekob's farm, gathering some swampweed, and telling Pyrokar, Vatras, and Zardus to meet at the Sun Circle. You don't actively do anything, you just fetch items and talk to people. Even fighting the dragons is a little underwhelming, since the Eye of Innos really only lets you talk to them and forces them to tell you the truth, while the actual fights are kind of broken. Getting to the dragons is ultimately more interesting than fighting them. Gothic 1 certainly has its share of utterly banal quests, but its main quests almost always have some element of spectacle to them, which makes them far more interesting. Obtaining the Focus Stones, for instance, has you bumping into Diego, Milton, Lester, and Gorn, who are all out minding their own business and tag-teaming the task with them and usually using some type of spell to do something, like telekinesis to grab the stone from an unreachable ledge, or shrink monster to reduce a gargantuan troll down to a more diminutive size, or transform into Meatbug to fit under the crack in the wall. Crafting the Ulu Mulu lets you roam freely around the orc camp, which is interesting in and of itself, while other things like exploring the orcish cemetery with Baal Lucor and witnessing his descent into madness when he realizes there's nothing there and that the sleeper has led them astray, or having the entire old camp turn hostile when the old mine collapses, are all genuinely interesting things. Whereas Gothic 2's quests generally happen in the ordinary context of ordinary gameplay, which is great for immersion, Gothic 1 creates more unique scenarios for its quests, thereby making them truly stand out. Both Gothic games are open world and offer a lot of freedom to explore wherever you want at your own pace, and they both feature what I call dungeons, a bit similar to those in a typical Zelda game where you have to enter a contained space with a more linear structure to solve puzzles so that you can advance through the level to complete an objective. The problem with Gothic 2 is it really only has one of these dungeons, and that's the Halls of Irdorath, which happens at the very end of the game in the last chapter. If you include the Night of the Raven expansion, it has 2 with the Temple of Adanos and Jarkandar. Meanwhile, Gothic 1 has 4 in the Old Mine, the New Mine, the Orc Cemetery, and the Temple of the Sleeper, the latter of which is the biggest and most elaborate in the entire series. As much as I love exploring the open world, I find these dungeons are good for providing balance, since a more structured environment to explore with more concrete goals to solve can be more directly engaging than aimlessly wandering through forests or open fields, and Gothic 1 strikes a better balance in this department. The Gothic games use a chapter progression system tied to the main quest. As you advance the main quest, you advance the game into new chapters where the state of the world can be dynamically altered, opening up new areas for exploration, introducing new threats and challenges, and changing the circumstances around certain NPCs. While Gothic 1 has a lot of content in its first chapter, the amount of side content becomes practically zero once you advance to chapter 2 and beyond, leaving you with no choice but to progress through the main quest, which becomes a matter of mostly running back and forth across the map to get to your next objective. It's fine because the main story is solid, and the main quests are all pretty interesting, with unique gameplay scenarios and fun situations, but it doesn't really take advantage of the open world format when, for the bulk of the game, you can only really go through a linear sequence of main quests. Mechanical depth is one of the main areas where Gothic 2 made tremendous improvements over the original, since the RPG and character building portion of Gothic 1 was, in truth, a little simplistic since it didn't have a whole lot of skills, and some of them were kind of useless. Animal skinning is mostly only used in both games as a way to earn money, but money is incredibly easy to come by in the first game, and so it's kind of worthless. You don't need to actually learn lockpicking to be able to pick locks, and pickpocketing doesn't work really that well. You can forge crude swords with a blacksmithing skill, but that's about it. So really, the only skills worth learning are combat skills, and it's pretty easy to max out your character's stats and combat skills in the early stages of the game, leaving you with nowhere else to grow over the rest of the game. Gothic 2, in contrast, expands weapon forging into something more useful, makes thieving skills actually require skill points to learn while also making them incredibly useful, makes learning magic spells and increasing combat skills a more involved process, and adds other skills like potion making and rune making. The expansion adds even more things to spend skill points on, and balances the pacing of the level progression to better match the chapter progression and game length. I think it's pretty easy to argue that Gothic 2 is the objectively better game because it's basically the same thing as Gothic 1 but with way more total content and better mechanical depth. I especially love how it reuses characters and locations from the first game, since it establishes a strong sense of continuity between the two. Returning to the colony from Gothic 1 and seeing how much it's changed from the Orc invasion and the dragons is truly stunning and is one of my all-time favorite gaming memories. So here are some of the ways that Gothic 2 improved upon Gothic 1's already successful formula. As I already mentioned, Gothic 1 became pretty linear after its first chapter since there wasn't much else to do in the world but follow the main quest line. Gothic 2 also uses a linear main quest line tied to chapter progression, but more of its quests allow for non-linear progression, like when you're tasked with getting into town and have multiple ways to do that based on how you choose to explore and interact with the world, along with other quests like doing the stone circles, or exploring the mansions of the builders, or killing dragons, or getting the blood chalices in whatever order you want. Many of its quests give you broad objectives that don't necessarily follow a step-by-step progression from point A to point B, or C or D. They're fairly open-ended in terms of how you arrive at the solution, even if there is only one intended solution. Meanwhile, the world itself is a lot more open, with more diverse areas to explore and a less centrally focused design, which makes it easier to get lost, literally, in its world. Plus, it also opens itself up the more you play, with the Valley of Mines, Jarkandar, and the Halls of Irdorath all being introduced in later chapters, thus providing you with constant opportunities to explore new areas and to veer off the main path. Gothic 1 has some strong dynamic elements, notably with how the entire old camp gets shut down after the old mine collapses, and how the water mages turn hostile after you drain the magical energy from the ore mound, but Gothic 2 takes this concept one step further by more radically altering the world and changing the situation of various areas and characters as the chapters advance. Normally in Gothic 1, all advancing a chapter does is cause a few enemies to respawn while allowing the main quest to advance to the next stage. In Gothic 2, returning to Korinnes in Chapter 3 adds Seekers, the Black Mage henchmen of Beliar, all over the map, and the various farmers and townsfolk have all new quests and interactions related to the appearance of these Seekers. In Chapter 4, when you return to the Valley of Mines, the Paladins have been further decimated while the Dragon Hunters have now arrived, thus introducing new quests and interactions with them. In Chapter 5, when you return to Korinnes again, orcs and/or lizardmen have invaded the outskirts of town, once again introducing new threats and new quests/character interactions. The effect is that the world feels more alive because of how much it changes and reacts to the main story. Many of Gothic 2's quests overlap with some other quest, or have NPCs involved with multiple ongoing quests. Becoming an apprentice in town, for instance, involves gaining the favor of the various master craftsmen, which means doing quests for each of them to prove your worth. Gaining Mateo's favor involves getting the money he's owed from the carpenter Thorbin's niece, and so you can talk to Thorbin about the money and also learn that he's indebted to Lamar the Loan Shark, which can trigger another quest to help clear Thorbin's debt, and Thorbin is also part of the Missing People quest since his apprentice Elvrich has gone missing, in addition to having his own quest to earn his favor by proving your devotion to the god of light, Innos. By just talking to one person, you end up involved in an entire network of quests. In fact, pretty much everything in town is somehow related to something else, so it's nearly impossible to talk to someone or do something without also making progress in another quest. Gothic 1 has some overlap in its quests, or situations where one quest will unexpectedly lead to another one, like when Thoris tasks you with getting rid of Mordrag, which is also part of joining the old camp, and you end up picking up a quest from him to visit the new camp, but these tend to be more incidental and aren't as pervasive as the ones in Gothic 2's main hub areas. Some areas in Gothic 1 can be a little sparse, with not much to really see or do within them. Not many enemies to fight, not much loot to find, and not much interesting terrain to explore. Plus, the relatively small size of the world means you can easily explore most everywhere in the first chapter and have little else to discover over the rest of the game. Gothic 2's map, besides being much bigger, is also a lot more densely packed with content, with something interesting to see or do around every corner and everywhere you look. It's also full of rewarding secrets that make it really worth your while to check behind every tree and under every rock. A lot of times they're just skeletal corpses with a few worthwhile supplies like potions, spell scrolls, or even a weapon or jewelry. But other times you discover more elaborate areas like hidden caves and secret chambers with more valuable riches awaiting inside. The world, therefore, is a lot more engaging, rewarding, and satisfying to explore in Gothic 2 than in Gothic 1. The only real criticism I can level against Gothic 2 is that some of its content, and therefore some of its total playtime, can be tediously repetitive. The Valley of Mines, for instance, has orcs plastered all over the map, admittedly for good reason, since they're supposed to be laying siege to the castle, having overrun the entire colony. It makes narrative sense, and it also serves a mechanical purpose of literally overwhelming you with tough enemies. But that makes exploring the Valley of Mines a real chore when you have to spend hours just fighting orcs to get anywhere. Likewise, as much as I appreciate the dynamic changes to the main maps as chapters progress, it does get a bit annoying having to basically re-explore all of Khorinis in Chapter 3 and again in Chapter 5 because of the new quests and enemies introduced in those chapters. A similar thing happens in Chapter 4 when you return to the Valley of Mines, although it's not quite as egregious. As much as I appreciate the size of the world and all the dynamic changes that occur within it as the game progresses, I got a little annoyed in the second half of my recent playthrough by feeling like I was retreading a lot of the same paths and doing the same things over and over again. To conclude this video, both games are really good and I like them equally. As I said before, I like to consider them as essentially one game, indistinguishable from the other. But if I had to pick one as the definitively better game, I think I'd have to give the nod to Gothic 2 for its superior gameplay. I really appreciate the original setting and unique atmosphere of the first game, plus its more interesting story, but you can definitely tell that Piranha Bytes were still figuring out the gameplay formula, what with it being their first game. A perfect game would essentially take the gameplay of Gothic 2 and drop it into Gothic 1's world and story. Such a game doesn't exist, however, so really the best option is just to play both games back to back as two parts of a single game and enjoy each of them for their own individual strengths and the complete package they provide together. And that's all I have for this video. If you enjoyed it, then be sure to check out my blog for more of my written reviews and articles, and also keep an eye out for me on Twitch if you want to catch me live streaming the games I'm playing. I'm also on Patreon if you want to support me that way while gaining access to early reviews and impressions, news updates, and polls to vote on what games I play next. So thanks for watching, folks. I'll talk to you next time.